Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. So this is the Xbox Series S. You may have heard of it. Now traditionally, I don't buy a console during its first year of release. I usually wait a couple years so that way all the AAA titles have already started launching. But I'd heard enough great things about this device that I decided to pick one up and showcase it here on this channel. Now obviously the Xbox Series S can play Xbox games. I mean, that's primarily what it's used for. But if you know anything about this channel, that's not really what I like to focus on. So in today's video, I want to focus on the emulation capabilities of this little Xbox. Now amazingly, all of this emulation is capable through the official Microsoft development program, which means you don't have to do any sort of jailbreaking or hacking into your device at all. It's literally just paying a $19 lifetime fee to have access to their development kit program. Now my plan is here that I'm going to make a separate video that I'll release this weekend, which will actually guide you through that entire process and how to set up all this emulation. But in today's video, I want to focus on the emulation capabilities of this device in the first place. Essentially, I want to make the argument that for $300, this is the best emulation machine that you can buy for that money. And potentially, I'm going to ruffle a few feathers along the way, but I think that by the end of this video, you'll have no other choice but to agree that for $300, the value that you're going to get in emulation and just in general Xbox gaming is pretty awesome. So we'll do a quick unboxing, walk you through how you set up an Xbox, and then I'll show off what it can do. I'm super excited about this one, so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, we're going to focus on the Xbox Series S in this video, but I do want to show you some of its specs alongside the more powerful Xbox Series X. Both of these devices have 8-core CPUs, and GPUs which are measured in teraflops, and I'm not even going to pretend that I know what any of this means. But one of the biggest points when it comes to emulation is the storage size. The Xbox Series S has 512 gigs, whereas the Series X has a terabyte. We'll talk about storage later in this video. Now in terms of price, I already said the Xbox Series S is $300, and the Series X is $500. But the latter comes with a disk drive, and more on that later as well. Okay, so those are the specs. Let's talk about what comes in the box. So it has a high-speed HDMI cable, a power cable with no brick, thankfully, a couple AA batteries, I can't believe they still use these, and a new controller. This is a nice feeling controller. It reminds me of the Xbox One, but has a grittier feel to it. And the biggest overall change is this D-pad. It feels a little bit like a cup, and it's very clicky. But honestly, it's a pretty good D-pad. It is a little bit loud though. So moment of truth here, this thing is actually pretty tiny for a console, much smaller than any other Xbox I've ever seen. On the front you have a single USB port and a connection button. And then on the back you have gigabit Ethernet, 2 USB 3.1 ports, HDMI 2.1 port, an expandable storage slot, and then your power connector. And that's really about it. I plan on storing mine vertically, but it looks pretty good horizontal too. To give you an idea how small it is, look at how it compares to a Nintendo Switch. It's not that much bigger. It's actually just about the same size as my keyboard, which isn't even a full-size keyboard. It is an impressively small device considering how powerful it is. It's almost in that mini PC range. So let's go ahead and plug it in and turn it on, and I'll show you the new Xbox logo. Okay, well that's pretty good. So first getting started here, when I signed into my Xbox Live account, it basically made the same dashboard that I have on my Xbox One. So the first thing I wanted to do was go into my digital library and see which games I have that have crossed over from my original 360 and from my Xbox One to now. And luckily I've had an account for something like 15 years now, so I have a ton of games. Most of these I picked up for free during Games with Gold or got super cheap when they were on sale. I did find that very few of them are actually optimized for the Xbox Series S. Only things like Destiny 2 and a couple others. And so I wanted to try out the gaming capabilities of the device, and so I picked the game that has Xbox Series S optimizations, but has the smallest file size. So I downloaded the 19 gig file and then just started playing it, and you know what? It works great. I already played through this game on the PS4 a while back, but it's a good game. And that's the start of my other point, is that most of the games that I actually really want to play are on disc, and I have no way of accessing those games at all, even though I already paid for them. Take, for example, the Master Chief Collection. I bought this on disc when it first came out, and then I also bought it on Steam a few months ago. But none of that actually matters, because Microsoft expects me to pay another $40 to play this game. And unfortunately, they were right. I paid another $40 to play Halo again. Now, I totally did not need to do this, but I love playing these old Halo games. And also, I wanted to prove a point about the fact that if you do own a lot of Xbox discs, it means nothing if you buy an Xbox Series S. And that transition to digital is both frustrating and expensive. So for example, if you wanted to have just a bunch of games on your Xbox, there's only 512 gigs on here, which is going to go very fast on some of these larger games. For example, the Master Chief Collection is over 115 gigabytes. So you have two options. The first is to buy an external hard drive like this one, and it will store all of your games. But the thing is, in order to actually launch the game itself, the game has to be moved from the external hard drive over to your internal storage. Which means two things. You have to keep a lot of space free on your internal storage, and you're going to have to wait to move those files back and forth every time. Now, Microsoft does have a solution for it, and it's called a storage expansion card. And this is a 1 terabyte solid state card that's made by Seagate. And basically you can just plug this right into the Xbox, and it's going to expand your storage to a total of 1.5 terabytes. But the kicker here is this thing costs $220. So all of a sudden, the price difference between a 1 terabyte Xbox Series X with the disk drive and the Series S with no disk drive and this expansion slot is about the same. So if you have a lot of disks, I think it's really worth considering the Xbox Series X. Now, since I already had the Xbox Series S, I went ahead and bought the expansion card anyway, and luckily it was actually very easy to set up. So getting set up with emulation is actually really simple. First thing you have to do is go over to Microsoft's partner page and then sign up for their developer program. It's as simple as just registering and then paying a $19 fee. And this is a one-time fee, it's not annual or anything else like that. So once you've registered, the next thing you have to do is install an application that'll boot into the dev kit side of the operating system. And then once you're on this side, it's basically a sandbox for development. So the first thing you have to do is make storage for the development side. And this is where that internal storage comes into play even more. So essentially, this is going to leave you with 128 gigs less internal storage on the Xbox side. So now you can see why I'm making such a big deal about the internal storage capabilities of the Xbox. The Series X, which has a terabyte of storage to use, means that you could expand this to 256 and not really cause that much of a dent. Okay, so once you've expanded your storage, everything else just kind of falls into place. For example, you can map a network drive on your computer, and then you can just drag and drop your files from your PC to the Xbox. And that's how you install things like RetroArch, which has its own build specifically for Xbox. Now in the next video, I'll show you how to set all this stuff up, but as you can see here, I've already spent a day testing and building playlists and things like that. And it's definitely not perfect yet, but it's at least functional, and it's good enough to show you the emulation capabilities of the Xbox Series S. So let's dive into gameplay performance. We'll start with the hard stuff first. Okay, when it comes to classic games, things like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, you're going to have absolutely zero problems here. Honestly, the only big hiccup is going to be getting used to playing these games on an Xbox controller. But I've got a few tricks up my sleeve when it comes to that, and I'll focus on that in my next video. Moving along, most handheld systems play great. Game Boy Advance in particular looks really good. Now unfortunately, Nintendo DS is where the first hiccup came. So you can play Nintendo DS in its native resolution no problem using the Melon DS core. But when you try to increase the resolution, it actually doesn't work on this core right now. And if you try some of the other cores, they definitely will upscale to a higher resolution, but it will severely impact performance, to the point where the games will be unplayable. So performance of a Nintendo DS is only really good at its native resolution. Now other RetroArch cores are much more developed. For example, the DuckStation core on this is perfect. You can increase the resolution on your PS1 games no problem here. For the most part, I set everything to 1080p across this entire video. And while you could upscale your games to 4K, I should note that RetroArch only outputs to 1080p anyway. So for all the content that you're going to see in this video, I'm just going to upscale it to 1080p. And that's because there's no point, since that's what RetroArch caps out at. Either way, as you can see here, you can play all the PS1 games at 1080p, no problem. Even the hardest ones to play, like Tekken 3, does just fine. Same thing with Nintendo 64, for the most part, everything can play at 1080p at full speed. Typically, I like to test my games with F-Zero X because that's usually at the higher tier of emulation. And of course, it's always good to try GoldenEye 007. This game does experience frame dips, but by far, even at 1080p, this is performing much better than it did with the original hardware. Now, Dreamcast emulation was really interesting. Again, this is upscaled to 1080p, and the gameplay was super crisp and smooth, but for some reason my frames per second on the top right were all over the place. Now, I'm not saying I'm some expert when it comes to frames per second, but I'll say that this definitely feels like 60 frames per second. There's no way that Virtua Tennis 2 is playing at 30 frames per second here. I know what 30 frames per second feels like, and this feels like 60. So honestly, when it comes to Dreamcast, your best bet is actually just to turn off the frame rate, because if you don't see those frames per second, it's going to be just as smooth as you would expect it to be. And of all the games that I tested on Dreamcast, I could find only one game that had any slowdown, and it was NBA 2K1, which is really hard to emulate in the first place. So I would say if you're a Dreamcast fan, just rest assured that most of your games are going to play perfectly, even at a resolution of 1080p. When it came to arcade, I just tested out some of the harder games to emulate, so for example, Killer Instinct plays at full speed. And I also tested out some of the old favorites like Tekken Tag Tournament and Virtua Fighter. And the Xbox build of RetroArch supports a ton of different MAME cores, so if you want to get in the weeds and try to play a bunch of different arcade games, I think the capability is there. Okay, when it came to Sega Saturn, this was a little bit disappointing. When you try to play it at 1080p, you can definitely feel some slowdown. But if you downgrade that to 2x resolution, it still looks really good and plays perfectly. So I think that's a relatively easy fix. You're not going to have like super high definition Sega Saturn, but I've never felt that Sega Saturn is something that should be upscaled to 1080p anyway. Either way, just know that Sega Saturn runs really well on the Xbox Series S, even when you double the resolution. Okay, so moving over to PSP gameplay now. This one also played super well. I typically like to test PSP with Outrun 2006, and it's playing perfectly. Even God of War Chains of Olympus was playing really well at 1080p. I would get stutters here and there, for example when I used a new move, but for the most part everything played really smoothly. And most people know when it comes to PSP, the God of War games are typically the benchmark, because these are the hardest games to emulate. And given the fact that these play well at 1080p, kind of makes it a given that everything else is going to play perfectly too. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Ridge Racer is perfect. Tekken 6 also plays at full speed. And same thing with one of my other favorite PSP games, Virtua Tennis World Tour. The only weird hiccup with this one is that when it does a replay, it actually shows you a blank screen. But other than that, it plays just fine. Okay, so I think that's enough PSP, let's move on to GameCube. We'll start out with easy stuff here. As expected, Mario Kart Double Dash plays just fine. And at 1080p, it's still silky smooth. And of course, other easy games to play like 2D games such as Alien Hominid, they play just fine. I did see a little bit of slowdown in Mario Tennis, but it was only every once in a while, and typically again it was only when you were showing off a new move. The thing about Dolphin is that sometimes it needs to cache its 3D rendering, but all that really means is that the games are going to perform better the more you play them. So in general, other than those hiccups when you're caching shaders and 3D textures, for the most part GameCube will play at 1080p no problem. And they've been making some pretty good progress with the Dolphin emulator. For example, a couple weeks ago, analog triggers weren't working in the latest build of RetroArch. But just the other day when they updated RetroArch, they actually fixed that issue, so now analog triggers work fine. So after all my testing, the only game that I found that had consistent slowdown was Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader. And this is generally known as the hardest game to emulate on the GameCube, which is a little bit unfortunate because it's such a good game. But you know, another game that's also really hard to emulate is F-Zero GX. And this game performed so well that it basically made my capture card crap out. You can see how pixelated everything is. It looked really beautiful on my screen, but unfortunately the capture card just couldn't keep up. And I also found that the Metroid Prime games did play really well, but they also had slowdown when you were caching new shaders and textures. Either way, a completely enjoyable experience. Okay, moving on to Nintendo Wii. A lot of these games played really well, especially some of the easier ones to emulate. For example, New Super Mario Bros. Wii played perfectly. Resident Evil 4 was relatively smooth as well. You'd get a little bit of slowdowns here and there, but for the most part I would say it was perfectly enjoyable. Now one of the nice things about this Dolphin Core is it allows you to emulate different Wii remote control setups. For example, here with the Metroid Prime trilogy, I have it set so that the right analog stick functions as my pointer with the Wiimote, which basically turns this game into a twin-stick shooter. It takes a little bit of trial and error to get it set up, but I'll include it in my written guide when I publish that in a few days. Along those same lines, you can use a similar setup for things like Super Mario Galaxy. You basically use the left analog stick to control Mario, and then the right analog stick to pick up all these little star things. But yeah, in general, I was very impressed with Nintendo Wii. I was especially impressed with Super Paper Mario because the graphics were so crisp and clear at 1080p. And I even thought to myself, man, this is definitely something I would like to play through. And it was basically at that exact moment where the game crashed. And I'm not sure if this crashes every time you get to this moment in the game, but I'll have to try it out later and see if it works. So probably the best example of this whole caching thing on Dolphin is Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. In this one, every time you do a new special move, it'll give you a hiccup for a second. But then the second time you do that same move, it'll be just fine. So it's really just a matter of playing this game a lot so that you don't have any of those first appearances of moves. In general, the only Wii game that I found unplayable was Mario Kart Wii, and that's because of this weird shader box that appears on this specific core. And there are patches and other fixes that are available for this, but I thought I'd point it out in case you have this problem in the future. Okay, so the last console I want to show off here is the PS2. Now unfortunately, PS2 performance is not as great as I was hoping. You can definitely play a lot of games at a 1080p resolution, but you are going to experience some slowdown. For example, here with God of War, when you're playing with some of the smaller areas, it seems to play pretty well. But say I downgrade to the native PS2 resolution, and then I go into a larger scene, you can see how much slowdown there is. It's dropping down to something like 46 frames per second. So if it's going to dip even with native PS2 resolution, you might as well increase the resolution to 1080p anyway, and at least enjoy the nice visuals. So unfortunately, some games, even when you play them in a native resolution, are just not going to perform very well on the PS2. And honestly, I don't think it's the Xbox's fault. I think it has to do with the maturity of the PCX2 core and RetroArch. It's only been around for less than a year at this point, so I think we're going to find optimizations down the road, but for now it's kind of a work in progress. That being said, some games play just fine. Grand Theft Auto 3 was perfect. In general, I would just have expectations that if you are going to play a PS2 game, it's going to feel a little bit sluggish. Now that being said, I was surprised to find how many games wouldn't actually boot at all. So for example, here's Jak and Daxter running the latest RetroArch core, and it'll boot into the BIOS screen, and you'll see the regular PlayStation 2 boot logo, but right after that, it's going to crash the entire app. Now, one thing I'll show you in the guide is that you can downgrade the core and try a different core and see if that's going to play better. And sure enough, downgrading to the 1.9.6 RetroArch core does make Jak and Daxter boot, but unfortunately it gives you all these weird graphical artifacts too. And same thing goes with all the games I'm showing here. These are all games that wouldn't work on 1.9.9, the most recent RetroArch build that I was using for this video, but they did play on the 1.9.6 build. But unfortunately, it had a lot of graphical artifacts, to the point where I considered it to be unplayable. It's really just going to be hit or miss. For example, Ratchet & Clank Size Matters doesn't boot on the other one, but it does boot on 1.9.6, and it plays just fine. But then, games like Sly Cooper 3, which had no graphical artifacts, played super slow. You can see you're getting about 27 frames per second at 1080p. And even downscaling it to native resolution only gives you about 40 frames per second. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error when it comes to PS2. Okay, so this is the Xbox Series S. And I gotta say, I'm super impressed with the amount of emulation that you can do on this. And so yeah, in addition to all the Xbox things that you can already do on the device, all the Master Chiefing and Hellblading you want to do, it also functions as a dual booting emulation device. And while the interface itself is probably not as beautiful and streamlined as something like Batocera or Emulec, it's still pretty cool to see what this machine is capable of. So let's go ahead and summarize this entire experience. Let's talk about what I like and what I don't like when it comes to emulating on the Xbox Series S. We'll start with what I like. Number one, this is a bargain at $300. To me, I don't think there's a single thing that you could buy for $300 at retail value that's going to have this much emulation performance. And in addition to that, my second bullet is it plays Xbox games too. And not only can it play Xbox games and play them at 1440p with up to 120 frames per second, but you could also use this as a 4K media streaming device too. So if you wanted to, you could use this as a Netflix machine, your Amazon Prime Video, whatever it is you happen to use to watch your video. You can also do all of that on this device as well. And to top it all off, that $300 also gets you a nice controller. Now this controller is sold on its own for something like $60 or $70. Now when it comes to form factor, this thing is small and sleek. It's easily the smallest Xbox that's ever been made, and it looks really nice on my desk. And I really love the fact that this whole development kit thing and emulating on your Xbox is 100% legal and a very innovative thing for Microsoft to unlock. I love the fact that they've made this so developer friendly. And finally, my last point is that RetroArch is mostly good on this. Sure, it's not perfect, but no emulator ever is. And it's nice to be able to emulate all of these consoles under one single roof. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the things that don't impress me about this device. Number one is the limited amount of storage that you have internally. At 512 gigabytes, I felt like I had my arm tied around my back before I had even opened this thing up. And sure, you can expand it with a $220 expansion card, but unfortunately, even then, it doesn't give you the ability to use that on the emulation side at all. So it's literally there just to allow you to store more Xbox games. And I'm probably not the primary customer when it comes to this device in particular, but I really lament the fact that I don't have a disk drive on this device, because so many of my games are on disk that I feel like I'm losing a big opportunity to play all those games. Okay, when it comes to the emulation side of the house, RetroArch is pretty good, but it is also a complex system. I've spent about a year now getting myself familiar with the platform, and I still have a lot to learn, which means that if you're going to jump into this without having any background knowledge in RetroArch, it's going to be a pretty steep learning curve. It's not impossible, but I do want to temper your expectations. And unfortunately, PS2 performance on this is not very good. I think it comes down to the fact that this emulator core in particular is still kind of getting started, so we'll probably see optimizations down the line, but it may be another year or two before we see something really good. And overall, the entire emulation experience could definitely use a front end. It would be super cool if somebody like Launchbox or Batocera made a specific build that worked on this Xbox side. And I realize that's a ton of work, but it would still be super cool. So that way we would have something a little bit nicer to navigate than just the regular RetroArch menus. And overall, I would say that this entire program, the whole Xbox development kit, as well as RetroArch on an Xbox, is still in its infancy. So I would expect a year from now, I'll probably do a follow-up video and show you all the great improvements they've made over time. For now, it's pretty good, but I'm hoping that in a year, it's going to be great. And my last point here is that the Xbox Series X might actually be a better deal than the Series S. Now granted, the Series X is really hard to find right now, but I do think that that $500 price is justified when you think about the 1TB storage it has internally, and the fact that it has better performance so it might last longer, and you can play your disc games on it. Now I'm not trying to say that the Series S is not a good deal, I'm just saying that the X might actually be a better deal in the long run. So overall, what do I think about this whole experience? Well, to be honest, it's kind of amazing. To give you some context, here's a $200 mini PC that I set up about a week ago. Now for this thing, you have to install your own hard drive, flash a firmware on it, and then put all your games on it, and then tweak everything to make it work. And even then, after you're done putting it all together, which is going to cost you about $250, this little PC can barely emulate GameCube games. And while that seemed like a pretty good proposition about a week and a half ago, this Xbox Series S has basically redefined that experience. At $300 new, you're not going to find a better emulation experience than this device. And sure, it could definitely be better, and I think we're going to see that here in the future, but for now, I'm super excited. To tell you the honest truth, I barely got this video out in time, because all I wanted to do was sit at my TV and play this thing, because it's been so much fun. And that often doesn't happen with the devices that I review. So that's really about it for this video. I know this is a long one, but I hope you liked it. And be sure to tune in this weekend when I do an entire guide about how to set this all up on your device. For now, let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this something that you now are considering? Or what other emulation alternatives do you have in mind? As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.